On a Wednesday afternoon, my mom called to tell me my grandmother was dying. I had no reaction. I hadn't seen or talked to my grandmother since she moved to Florida when I was a teenager. That was 20 years ago. My grandmother was a miserable old curmudgeon, and we never had much of a relationship. Or so I thought. The doctor said my grandmother had days to live, and my mom and dad were heading down to Florida to say their goodbyes. They wanted to know if I wanted to come along. Sure, I said, even though I had nothing to say to her. The woman was practically a stranger. My only memories of my dad's mother were of her dusty house that smelled of mold, and how she stared daggers at me when I was a small child. But when I hung up the phone with my mom, other memories began clawing their way to the surface. Fragments and snippets, mainly, but they were there. My childhood bedroom, an old telephone, and my grandmother's voice on the other line. I began to put it together, a sequence of events that had sunk deep down to places I couldn't find. And so the night before we were supposed to leave for Florida, I sat down in my parents' living room and attempted to assemble the puzzle. Speaking to my parents with a mug of hot chocolate in my hand, my story spilled out. When I was 10 years old, I had an old rotary phone with a spinning and clicking dial on the nightstand next to my bed at 2 a.m. One night, the clanging ring of the phone startled me awake. I picked up the receiver and heard nothing but ragged and harsh breathing. It went on, and I just lay awake in bed with the receiver at my ear, just listening. I eventually fell asleep, and I awoke with the receiver still on my shoulder and the dial tone beeping in my ear. A few nights later, the phone rang again at 2 a.m. I lifted the receiver and was again greeted with the same labored breath. But this time, there was a voice, my grandmother's voice. Someone's been a bad boy, a very bad boy. The words came out slow and methodical, each syllable more important than the last. I just listened in my dark and quiet room, unable to move, unable to run to my parents. No one knows what you did, but I know. The mug of hot chocolate shook in my hand as I told my parents what I heard my grandmother say. My dad's eyes were glazed over, deep in thought, like he couldn't believe that his own mother would do something like this. My mom looked at me with pleading eyes that begged the question, why didn't you tell me when it happened? The fact is, I was a bad boy. I'd done typical and naughty 10-year-old things. I'd slugged a kid on the playground and broke his glasses. I'd pocketed a candy bar at the store without paying. I'd cheated on a spelling test. Somehow my grandmother had known these things, and I remembered being a kid, lying in bed with that phone at my ear, desperately not wanting my parents to discover the awful things I'd done. Because somehow my awful, wretched grandmother knew. I'm not sure how many calls there were, a handful perhaps. But one night, a few weeks after the first phone call, the situation changed. I was again awoken by the clanging of the phone in the dead of night. I lifted the receiver from its cradle and put the phone to my ear, and I was greeted by the hoarse breathing of an old woman. I'll be there soon. I know what you did. Ben. My name is not Ben, but that didn't make the least amount of difference to me at the time. The phone went dead in my ear, and I then noticed the silence all around me. I listened intently to every creak in the house, every rustle of the wind through the tree branches outside my window, and then I heard the jiggling of the front door downstairs. I crept from my room and tiptoed down the hallway, and I knelt down at the top of the stairs, peering through the wooden railings. The front door squeaked open, no more than 6 inches, and a hand reached inside, gripping the end of the door. I gawked at the hand's bony fingers and fingernails so long that they were beginning to curl. And I heard the breathing, the same gravelly and throaty noise from the phone. I turned away, put my back against the railings, hugged myself, and began to cry. My dad must have heard my whimpering because suddenly he was there, picking me up and sheltering me. I remember my eyes pinching shut and not looking at the doorway. I wasn't sure if the woman with the curved fingernails had come all the way inside or if she'd simply slinked away into the night. My dad took me into his bedroom and I slept between my parents, shivering softly. My story ended. That was all I could remember. My parents sat in silence until my mom spoke up. She remembered that night. It was the only time after the age of 5 that I'd crawled into bed with them. My dad still looked spaced out. He had no memory of that evening, he said. Couldn't remember picking me up. Couldn't remember carrying me into my parents' bedroom. My mom put her hand on my shoulder and told me how proud she was of me for finally letting it out. I could only laugh softly. I wasn't purposefully holding it in all this time. I didn't know the story was there to begin with. We decided to still go visit my dying grandmother. In the end, it was my decision. If I wanted answers, I didn't have long to get them. I looked into my future and saw a lifetime of wondering just how this monster could do something like that. I didn't want to live like that. So I seized on my only chance for closure. I told my mom and she nodded, saying whatever I wanted to do was fine. The 3 of us were silent throughout the flight. My mom bit her lower lip and sat with a crossword puzzle on her lap for 3 hours, not filling in more than 5 words. She simply turned the pen over and over in her hand. My dad stared blankly out the window, as if my mom and I weren't even there. Neither of them asked me any more questions about my phone calls. I got the distinct feeling my mom wanted to. She'd steal a look at me, start to speak, but decide against it. We touched down in Florida, cabbed it to the hospital, and were about to walk through the sliding glass doors when my dad stopped. He turned around, red in his eyes, and he began to sob. He collapsed onto a bench and said he couldn't go through with this. He couldn't accuse his own mother. He couldn't interrogate a feeble old woman on her deathbed. I had an affair, he stammered, 20 years ago, and he had a child with another woman. A child the woman named Ben. My mom and I stood in the shadow of the hospital, shell-shocked. My story had finally opened up something inside of him, my dad said, and he was determined to stop living a lie. I left my parents and dazedly stumbled inside. Nothing made sense. I needed to see my grandmother. I needed to know the truth. I found my way to my grandmother's room, and she was already dead. My aunt and uncle stood vigil by her frail corpse, holding her hand. There were no curling fingernails, no elongated fingernails, no elongated fingers. Just a wrinkled, dead woman. Maybe if I'd gone inside minutes earlier, I'd have recognized that horse breath as my grandmother inhaled and exhaled one last time. But now I'd never know. I looked through the window and watched my father wander aimlessly around the hospital grounds, lost inside the new, hazy world he'd created for himself. And I wondered how it must feel to keep a secret that you do know about for 20 years, and then how it feels to get something like that off your chest. And I wondered about the other woman, and about Ben, and where they are now, and if I'd ever ran into them at the supermarket or driven past their house. And I wondered about the person that called me on the phone and crept into my house all those years ago. Was it not my grandmother after all, and just some cruel trick played by my dad's mistress? Or someone that knew about my dad's affair? It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was my mom. I found her sunk into a lobby sofa, and I sat down next to her. She looked oddly peaceful. She probably just hadn't absorbed everything yet. I put my hand on my mom's shoulder, and then she thanked me for telling my story, for remembering it all, because it brought out the truth from my dad. And even though the truth was horrible and would change things forever, it was good to know. But then I began to question my own story. Was it all in my head? Why did I not remember any of it until a few days ago? My eyes welled with tears. I told my mom it felt like I'd destroyed our family because of a story that could be make-believe, a story from the mind of a 10-year-old who was now lost to time. My mom reassured me. She believed my story was true. She didn't know who was in our house and what my dad might have seen that night, but she believed me. But still, she said, there's one part of my story that she didn't understand. That old rotary phone in your bedroom. You do remember that was a play phone, right? I just want to tell somebody this story. It fits here, I think. You'll see why I really can't tell my husband. So my husband, Let's call him Joe. Joe has been an attorney for about 12 years, and for the past 6 years, he's been working as a public defender. If the state appoints him to represent a criminal, or a criminal defense lawyer, if a person hires him to represent a criminal, he specializes in, and therefore primarily does, appellate cases. And so most of his clients are convicted felons. Think what you want about what he does for a living, but I can tell you for sure, he is a good guy with a strong belief that he is protecting all of our constitutional and human rights with the work he does. He's been spending a lot of time with his current client during this preparation phase of his case, and this means he's had to spend a lot of time out at the prison. His client is a high-profile felon, twice convicted of capital murder. If I said his name, you would know who he was, and then could easily figure out who my husband is too. So I'm going to leave it at that. Regardless, this guy is on death row, awaiting execution for 2 capital murders. But unlike the great majority of his past clients, my husband believes this man is 100% innocent. His client was convicted of killing an acquaintance and her son. There wasn't any physical evidence of the crime to speak of. In fact, the prosecution could never locate a crime scene. Other than a few strands of hair and 7 minuscule drops of blood, the primary evidence used to convict my husband's client was all circumstantial. Some emails, a couple of past incident reports involving my husband's client and the victim, a theoretical timeline established by some sketchy. Eyewitness accounts, video surveillance at a gas station, a few blocks from the location where the remains of the victims were finally found, and a 911 call from an unidentified male on the night the prosecution alleges the crime was committed. That's shaky evidence, at best. But when the person is an ethnic minority in a pro-capital punishment state, you would be amazed how little the day sometimes needs to convince 12 people to send somebody to the gas chamber. To be clear, my husband Joe isn't gullible. He's probably the smartest person I know, and he is well aware that most of his clients are actually guilty of the crimes they have been convicted of. In fact, this is only the 3rd time in his career he believes he is defending a totally innocent man. So with such a high-profile client and an appeal that will hopefully end with the freedom of a wrongfully convicted man, for Joe, this case is a career changer, life changer, really. He has put everything he has into it, sacrificed so much, and to free an innocent man from prison and save his life. This would validate every belief Joe has ever had about himself and why it is so important that he's doing the work he does. This is one of the reasons that I'm feeling so anxious about what happened last night, and the main reason that I can't say anything to him about what happened. When my husband makes the drive home from the prison, usually he leaves there at about 10 p.m. and it takes a little over an hour to get home. We talk on the phone. He calls me as he's driving away, and we stay on the phone together as he goes through whatever drive, who he's getting his dinner at, and then all the way until he parks the car in our garage. Normally, we don't talk about his case. We just talk about regular life stuff. What should I get at the store tomorrow? I gotta tell you what my sister said. Why is the stupid lawn dying? You know, stuff like that. It's a nice way for him to unwind from the day, I think. Usually when he calls, I'm already in bed. But I had a pretty tough day at work yesterday, and I had a pounding headache when I got home. I didn't even feel like eating. After I changed into my sweats, I took 4 Advil with a glass of wine. I know. Don't do that. And then I got in bed and turned on the TV. I probably fell asleep around 9. And when the phone rang at 5 to 11, it woke me up. My phone said love of my life. Cell, that's his personal cell phone. But I knew it was Joe without having to read it. When he said hi, his voice sounded a little hoarse, a little tired too. But since he was leaving so late, it made sense. He asked me if he woke me up. I lied and said no. He said I sounded really sleepy. I told him he sounded weird too, but then he changed the subject. For some reason, he wanted to talk about the case. He said, I saw the photos of the crime scene today. There was just so much blood. Now, Joe has a dry sense of humor. Like I said before, the bodies of the victims had never been recovered. Just some bones and bone fragments. Joe has sometimes joked that he's worried that the secret photos of his client, drenched in blood and holding the heads of his victims. The Me speculated that from some of the marks on the bones, both victims had been decapitated, will show up in the judge's morning mail. So he knows that I know that there are no photos of the crime scene or the victims. Yeah, right, I said. He was joking, of course. I bet you found the knife too. You mean the axe? Nobody will ever find that axe. He laughed a little. A little morbid humor is sometimes what keeps things sane when you work for convicted felons. How far away are you? I started to ask, but he interrupted me. I remember exactly what he said, too. And today, I can't get it out of my head. You know, that first swing at her. The boy tried to grab the blade to stop it, mid-swing. Can you imagine? Like little 12-year-old fingers are going to stop the blade of an axe in mid-swing. It was probably a good thing that he went into shock when his fingers came off, though. Made it a lot easier on everybody. It takes a lot of chops to actually get somebody's head off. Even for Joe, this was overboard. I'd never heard him talk like this, and especially about this case. His statement was shocking. It sent a shiver up my spine. But then I thought about it. Stress and work exhaustion can make people do and say strange things. And I know that Joe has been under a huge amount of stress lately and has been working non-stop for months. So instead of reacting to what he said, I reacted to what I thought he was feeling. It's okay, Joe. It's going to be over soon, I said. And then we'll go to our beach house just like we planned and spend at least 2 weeks remembering what life is supposed to be like, right? We bought a wreck of a beach house about 3 years ago and have yet to spend any real time there. Joe and I are both looking forward to fixing it up. I heard him inhale, jagged breaths, as if he was about to start crying. I said something like, "He's an innocent man, Joe, and you are saving his life by proving it. Your case is solid, you know the truth." I really wanted him to remember that. I thought it would help. Joe didn't really respond, so I thought it was a good time to change the subject. "So, are you going to stop tonight?" I asked him. "I'm never going to stop," he whispered. And then I heard the garage door open, which made me jump practically out of my skin. "You're here already," I said into the phone. There's no way he got here so fast. But the call had ended. I heard the back door open and the sound of footsteps coming towards the bedroom. I would be lying if I said that, considering everything. I wasn't afraid. When Joe opened the door, I felt a huge amount of relief at the sight of him, but I was confused, especially considering how he sounded on the phone. He didn't look sad, he didn't look tired, and he didn't look stressed. In fact, he was happier than I think I have ever seen him. He sat beside me on the edge of the bed and hugged me tight as he told me the case was over. The new egg wasn't even going to go through with the trial. In a deal Joe had made just that evening, the state is allowing his client to plead guilty to second-degree murder and commuting his death sentence. Considering time served and his client's good behavior, Joe thinks he'll be out of jail in just a couple of weeks. It's over, Joe won. But the phone. I started to ask him. He told me his work cell was dead. He forgot the charger at the office. While he was hammering out the details of the new agreement with the AUG at the prison, he gave his personal cell to his client to play a game, with all the excitement. Joe accidentally left his cell phone with his client, and only realized it when it was too late to go back and get it. "No big deal," he said. "He'll get it tomorrow." Then he said he was sorry for not calling me. Let me begin by saying I've had the same phone number since I got my first phone in 6th grade, and I'm currently a freshman in college. So anyone who saved my number in like 2010 has my actual phone number. That being said, I'll be honest and say that my friends and I occasionally will call old childhood friends we haven't spoken to in ages on restricted numbers and fuck with them, just for the hell of it on boring Saturday nights. But this far surpasses the line of a friendly prank. I'm not exactly sure when it began, but it was during my junior year of high school. Back when I was 16, I answered every phone call and would mess with the telemarketers or strike up conversations with accidental wrong number callers. So when this unknown call came in, I thought nothing of it. But when I answered, there was nobody on the other line. I said hello a few times and asked if there was anyone there, but it was complete silence. So I simply hung up and didn't think much of it. Probably just one of my friends being dumb, which wouldn't be anything new, only they kept calling. At first, it was once every 3 or 4 weeks during the afternoon. I would ask my friends who it was, but they would laugh and proclaim their innocence. I shrugged it off until it started happening during class. In my high school, the teachers were pretty strict about phones unless it was during lunch. Of course, we still got away with texting and scrolling through Instagram, but a phone call in the middle of class. Not even the most lenient of teachers would allow that. One day I got up to go to the bathroom, and on my way I got a call from unknown. So out of curiosity I answered. Silence. Hello, I said into the phone, annoyed. At this point, it had been 2 or 3 months that I'd been getting these random phone calls. Who calls and doesn't say anything? After saying that, the silence broke and my stomach dropped. On the other end of the line was just breathing. Breathing that let me know there was always someone on the other end, but at that moment, it all started to click. If one of my friends had called, it would not be silent on the other end because, 1, I'd hear the chatter of the class, and 2, if they were breathing into the phone would be completely visible to the teacher, meaning it would be confiscated. I quickly hung up, startled at my new realization. After that, the calls came much more frequently and at all hours of the day and night, though I seldom answered them. But when I did, there was always heavy breathing on the other end. It was almost as if they were panting. Deep and heavy, like you just finished a jog. It was purely animalistic. I had never heard this caller speak, never even knew if they spoke, until I went to a college visit on a field trip. We had just finished the campus tour and had an hour to ourselves to explore the small downtown area that surrounded the school. Me and my friend, let's call him John, were exploring the small antique shops that littered the strip. As we were between stores, I got a call. Unknown caller. I stared at my ringing phone, and I must have noticeably tensed up because John asked who was calling. I told him I didn't know, and he offered to answer for me. I handed over my phone and listened as he spoke. Hello? He started. No, this is her friend John. She's not here right now. I watched in awe. Was the mystery caller having a conversation? Can I ask who's calling? John asked, and the unknown caller hung up. John shrugged, and I asked what they said, desperate for answers. Oh well, he asked if this was insert my name here, and I said no, and when I asked no, and when I asked who it was, he just hung up. I cannot describe the feeling of panic, dread, fear I felt at that moment. They knew my name. I told John the history of the caller, and he told me to tell the police. I, of course, did not listen. My father has been a cop for almost 30 years and has instilled in his children fear of strangers and the unknown. He always stressed the importance of only giving close friends our phone numbers, not speaking to people online, talking to strangers, etc. Because this had been happening for months now, and so often every week. I was scared to tell my father in fear that I would get in trouble and get my phone taken away. Obviously, looking back, I was an idiot, but I was 16 and my entire life was my phone, so I chose to handle it on my own, and I decided to block all unknown calls. After months of torment, finally, there was some silence. I had almost forgotten about the caller until the summer right after junior year, right before I became a senior. I was at my aunt's house for the weekend, and we were up at 3 a.m. telling different stories and strange encounters we've had. After hearing stories about mystery animals in the woods by our house and weird men at Kmart, I told her about the caller. She furrowed her brows and told me she didn't like that, but I showed her how I had blocked all incoming unknown callers. I then lifted the block, convinced that this anonymous guy surely must have given up after 3 months of being ignored, and we laughed it off, deciding to watch a movie to lighten the mood. Then, I shit you not, maybe 20 minutes into the movie I got a call. Unknown caller. My eyes darted to my aunt, and we stared at the phone in utter disbelief. She answered it and put it on speakerphone so we could both hear, but there was only silence. Hello, she asked. The panting began. I looked at her, fear saturating every inch of my being, and she quickly hung up. Needless to say, I put the lock back on. My last encounter with him was nearly 2 years ago, and yet I still have a fear of answering unsaved numbers, and unknown callers are still blocked. I never told my father any of this, even though he's retired. But because I have anxiety, well, almost every aspect of my life, my dad told me I need to learn how to get over some of my fears. So tonight, I'm feeling ballsy, and I'm deciding to lift the unknown caller ban. I am honestly terrified